Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in from around the world. I'm Trinwei Yap. I'm Research Director for the Hinrich Foundation. Thank you for joining us today as we introduce the fifth iteration of the Sustainable Trade Index. This index is a major piece of joint research by the Hinrich Foundation and Switzerland's IMD World Competitiveness Center. And here to kick us off with this introduction is our Hinrich Foundation Chief Executive Officer, Catherine Diot. Catherine?
Thank you, Chinwei, and welcome everyone to the fifth edition of the Sustainable Trade Index. Thank you to the talented team at IMD for your work to prepare the index, and thank you to our own team at the Hinrich Foundation for your contributions to the structure and insights of the STI. Congratulations to the high-performing economies for achieving more sustainable trade this year. And congratulations to those economies who've made progress up the rankings through policy change and sheer hard work. At the Hinrich Foundation, we believe global trade is an essential ingredient for economic growth. And for trade to be sustainable, its economic, societal, and environmental outcomes must be in balance. So the Sustainable Trade Index is a framework for governments, business, and communities to shape strategies and policies that leverage global trade for the prosperity and sustainability of economies. We hope that by highlighting these critical opportunities, the Sustainable Trade Index will prompt dialogue about the future direction of trade policy and set us back on a path of sustainable globalization. Now, the STI comprises interactive tables, a white paper, country reports, infographics, and an interactive Excel tool that is loaded with all the data. You should feel free to download and use all of these resources for your own purposes. Over the coming weeks, the IMD and Hinrich Foundation teams will highlight components of the Sustainable Trade Index through social media and video. And in the coming months, we will release deep dive research on particular indicators in the index. Please feel free to share the Sustainable Trade Index with your colleagues, business partners, and students. And most of all, please give us your feedback. Over to you, Chinwei.
Thank you, Catherine. We very much want to prompt dialogue for economic policy making. And, that's why this ranking essentially is one that covers 2/3 of the world's population, 2/3 of the world's GDP, and really takes us across a range of the key economies in the world on the Asia-Pacific Rim, in the UK, which is now in the CPTPP, in key parts of Latin America, and obviously US and China. And it's not just plain vanilla economic measures that the index is stacking up, such as inflation and current account levels. It also includes indicators on quite modern concepts such as forced labor and the evenness of economic development within an economy, for example. And in this age where we live in, where we're seeing a lot of trade fragmentation, the STI is tracking key indicators such as tariffs, non-tariff barriers, corruption levels, trade costs, and so on. So these are all issues that we intend to explore today with our panelists, whom I'm about to introduce. A bit of housekeeping first. You guys can, tuning in, can post questions anytime via the chat function on Zoom, and we will take them. You can interrupt anytime. We'll have the panelists address them at any point. Speaking of, here today with me are Christos Kabolis, who is Chief Economist of the IMD World Competitiveness Center. He was also the Executive Director of the International Center of Finance at the Yale School of Management. He used to teach at the UC Santa Barbara and University of North Carolina's Business School. So he writes a well-starred resume. And along with him, we have the Hinrich Foundation Senior Research Fellow, Steve Olson, who also writes a glittering resume. He was an former negotiator with the USTR. He was with US Commerce at a time when NAFTA was being hammered out. He used to teach at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He's the former president of the Hong Kong-based Pacific Basin Economic Council. Christos is now going to take us into an overview of this year's STI and what it tells us. Christos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wei. Greetings from rainy Lausanne. Good morning to those of you who are in a similar time zone with us. Good afternoon and good evening or good morning in the middle of the night to other areas within the world. We are extremely excited to show you our new results here today. And what I will try to do is I will try with my colleagues to put a little bit of structure in what we were discussing so far. So I will share my screen. With all of you. And we will speak about the Sustainable Trade Index of 2023. Let me try to bring the issues that we discussed in the beginning that Catherine and Wei brought. So our idea is really to measure the capacity of 30 diverse economies to align their global trade policies with some long-term objectives. These objectives are the economic growth, economic development, is the societal development, and the environmental protection. So the 30 economies that we are studying are members of the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. They're members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. We measure also Ecuador, that is an applicant to the CPTPP. We measure also the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership members, RCEP, and 4 major economies in the region of East Asia, namely Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Just to take an idea of what do we measure with respect to a global map, we have here for you the countries that we measure. As Wei said, this is an extremely important component both of the share of population around the world and of the share of GDP, the world GDP. So how do we try to measure this alignment of trade with growth, societal values, and environmental protection? We use 71 indicators, which we group in 3 different pillars: economic pillar, societal pillar, and environmental pillar. And we will go through those step by step, just to make sure that we have everything under consideration. In the economic pillar, what we try to measure is the ability of an economy to promote economic growth, economic development through international trade. So in essence, what we link, and this is, you will hear a repeat of some of the things that were said before, what we try to link is the economy on the one hand, inflation, foreign direct investments, the growth of labor, and so on and so forth, with the trade system, barriers of trade, non-tariff barriers of trade, trade liberalization, export concentration with respect to goods, but also to importing countries. All these are a very important component for what we try to measure. And what we found this year is that in this particular pillar, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, United States, and United Kingdom really top the ranking. Of course, you will ask, what are the characteristics that these countries share? And the characteristics of these economies are robust infrastructure, are strong commitment to technological innovation. Obviously, in order to have all these things working, you need adequate financing. And above all, you want a framework of trade liberalization, regional trade agreements, capital account liberalization, and so on and so forth. And hand in hand with that is the lower trading costs. This includes logistics, but also includes measures of corruption, measures of rule of law. In addition to the economic pillar, we measure the societal pillar. Now, the societal pillar actually tries to capture all the social factors that contribute to an economy's capacity to trade over the long run. And this, of course, includes two things. On the one hand, it includes development of human capital. And on the other hand, the trade part includes public's support for trade. So we bring indicators related with the development of human capital related to education, related to labor standards, related to life expectancy. On the public support, we include indicators that have to do with income inequality, political stability, whether goods are produced, are the products of modern slavery, and what is the government's response with respect to human trafficking. And in that pillar, you will see that Canada, New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, and Japan dominate this area. These countries are very strong with respect to political stability. They have economic equity, which is a very important component, high educational attainment, and social mobility. The third pillar that we study is the environmental pillar. And here we measure how an economy uses its natural resources, how the economy manages the externalities of the economic activity. So as you can imagine, there are elements, indicators that try to capture this usage and account of externalities now. For instance, air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, but also how these economies think about the future. So things like environmental standards, the share of national resources in trade, what exactly is going on with carbon emissions. And when we put all these things together, we found out that New Zealand, United Kingdom, Mexico, Philippines, and Singapore dominate this pillar. And the reason why they dominate this pillar is because they have very stringent, very high standards of environmental protection. They pay tremendous attention to the treatment of wastewater. They pay attention to air pollution and carbon emissions, and they have a very good, proper energy intensity. So when we put all these things together, we find the overall ranking, which is dominated essentially by New Zealand, United Kingdom, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia. And there are changes, of course, from our index from last year. And the reason for that is because different economies act in a different way moving forward. I think that I have covered everything that I needed to cover with respect to how we structured the methodology of the Sustainable Trade Index, STI, and I gave you an understanding of what exactly is going on with the three pillars. And I think now it's time to pass the microphone back to Ying-Wei and ask him to maybe continue the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christos. It's really interesting that you say, one thing that I picked up on in your presentation, that the ambition for all this is for the long run. The Sustainable Trade Index is something that the Hinrich Foundation and IMD is going to be publishing every year, starting from last year. So year by year, we are charting this for the long run, and we are doing this precisely because we believe that the effect of charting how policymakers address societal and environmental policies in addition to economic policies is something that you have to you have to watch how it manifests over a longer period of time for outcomes and necessities, needs that are actually quite immediate. So year by year, we are going to be looking at how these economies perform on each of these 71 and probably more as the years go by, indicators. It's also interesting that this pivots us very much to the question of policy making. And this is something that Steve has been closely associated with over the years. He talks to policymakers, he comes from policy, and he's going to share some insights now into what the findings this year in this year's STI might be for policymakers. Steve, over to you.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chun-Wei. Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted that so many of you could have joined us for today's discussion on sustainable trade. Now that Christos has given us such a clear and comprehensive overview on both the structure and the results from the 2023 STI, what I'd like to do is, as Chun-Wei suggested, is walk us through some of the key policy challenges, some of the key policy implications that face us as we continue our quest for sustainable trade. Now, I'm very happy to be able to say that there are many instances in which the objectives of sustainable trade across those three pillars, economic, societal, and environmental, are entirely aligned and mutually supportive. So we all can think of examples in which cleaner and greener manufacturing processes also have the added advantage of being more cost efficient, more cost effective. So the proverbial win-win situation, good for the environment, good for business, good for the economy. And in those instances, there are no difficult trade-offs that we have to wrestle with. But if we want to have a serious discussion on sustainable trade, and I know that we do, I think we have to recognize that there are also instances in which our objectives across those three pillars are not always in complete alignment. And we see this in particular in the case of trying to balance some of our more ambitious societal and environmental objectives with the need to maintain an open trade system, our need to keep trade flowing. Keep in mind that reducing trade barriers, reducing trade restrictions, and certainly avoiding additional layers of barriers and restrictions is a fundamental cornerstone of the concept of sustainable trade, perhaps the most fundamental cornerstone of sustainable trade. But reconciling that objective with some of our societal and environmental ambitions is not always an easy thing to do. And we see examples of this abounding. So think, for instance, of the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences program. Under this program, you've got roughly 15 developed countries that provide preferential tariff treatment to less developed countries. Now we're seeing more and more of those countries that grant GSP benefits, making it conditional upon less developed countries being able to demonstrate compliance with a series of fairly stringent social and environmental requirements. Now, in instances where these less developed countries simply lack the resources, lack the capacity, lack the capability of demonstrating compliance, those countries are in danger of being disenfranchised from some of these trade benefits. In a similar way, under the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, companies are required to conduct fairly exhaustive audits in their supply chain, looking for compliance with similar social and environmental requirements. And once again, we see that sometimes smaller companies in less developed countries struggle to meet the requirements to demonstrate their compliance. In those cases, these companies, the companies that need trade the most, are in danger of being dropped out of supply chains and being dropped out of global trade. But over the longer term, perhaps the most consequential example of this challenge we face is going to be the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. Now, CBAM is an entirely logical measure aimed at preventing carbon leakage. The European Union is one of the first jurisdictions to attempt to associate a cost with greenhouse gas emissions in manufacturing. This, however, presents us with an obvious problem. If the EU is charging for carbon and other jurisdictions are not, then you've created an incentive for European manufacturers to simply relocate to a no-cost jurisdiction and export their products back into the European Union. Hence the need for a quote-unquote border adjustment, essentially a tariff, to create a level playing field. The border adjustment would essentially recreate the cost that product would have faced if it had been produced in the European Union. Now, I want to be clear, from an environmental perspective, I think we all probably warmly welcome the CBAM. This is a program that could make substantial progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, an objective that I'm sure all of us share. But despite these environmental upsides, we've got to recognize that CBAM will very likely continue to stress an already overstressed trade system. And I say that for two specific reasons. The first is that, look, we can call it a border adjustment. We can use whatever terminology we'd like to use here, but it is essentially going to be a tariff. And like a tariff, it is going to have the same trade dampening effects, and unfortunately will probably largely affect less developed countries, those countries most in need of trade. The second respect in which it creates some challenges for us from a trade perspective is its impact on trade governance. A number of countries have already indicated their intention to challenge the CBAM as a violation of WTO rules. Now, trade experts are currently involved in a very enthusiastic debate over whether or not CBAM is a violation of WTO rules. My advice would be don't believe anyone who can predict what the ultimate outcome of any WTO cases might be. The only thing that we can be sure is that it's going to be a mess, and it could constitute yet another broadside against the WTO, particularly if any of the complainant countries decide to take retaliatory steps outside of normal WTO challenges. As most of you know, the WTO is already on fairly shaky ground, and this would be, as I say, yet another body blow. These types of trade battles are not what we need if we're interested in sustainable trade. Christos, could I have the next slide, please? Thanks very much. So given all this, what's the path forward for us? Well, I think we have to keep in mind that at the heart of the concept of sustainable trade is the need to strike balance across those pillars, oftentimes less than perfect balances and balances that frequently require compromises. Now, none of this is to suggest that any of the societal or environmental concerns that CBAM or other similar measures seek to address are not legitimate. It's plainly evident that they are legitimate and they are urgent. But the real issue and the real challenge is, how do we manage those trade-offs? How do we manage those trade-offs? Because don't lose sight of the fact that we have a real imperative here, given where we are in the global trade system, to keep it open and to avoid layering in additional trade restrictions and trade barriers. Now, of course, there are no easy or clear-cut answers here. Fortunately, however, we do have the Hinrich-IMD Sustainable Trade Index that can provide us with some useful insights into how 30 economies are at least trying their best to strike a balance across those three pillars. I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to any discussion, questions, or comments we might want to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I think what really jumped out at me from your presentation was the idea of reconciliation, and what the STI really is putting out there is a blueprint that reconciles the need for societal and environmental solutions to address the economic issues that have cropped up as a result of trade. It might be useful at this juncture to talk a little bit about what the Hinrich Foundation is. I mean, the Hinrich Foundation is a philanthropy. It has a fundamental, its goal, its mission is to advance global sustainable trade. So you might suspect correctly that we have a fundamental orientation toward openness, to the idea of mutual benefit, and to the idea that trust and trade are just expressions of each other between individuals, between companies, between countries. And we seek to address those problems right at the outset in ways that perhaps other philanthropies would address the outcomes of societal and environmental problems. We address them at the outset, at the formation of economic policy, of trade policy in particular. So it comes back to the question, as you rightly point out, Steve, of reconciliation. It's a really important time to be considering these factors because, as Catherine pointed out in her foreword to the white paper of the Sustainable Trade Index, which all of you should be downloading along with the interactive index, is the idea of the headwinds that the global economy is now facing. I mean, all trade assessments across all the reputable acronyms, IMF, OECD, and so on, are going down. I mean, expectations are not high. We're facing a lot of issues. I mean, that much is obvious. Among the other things that the STI shows us is that just because you do well in one pillar, it doesn't mean that you're going to do that well overall, because the other pillars count. The US, for example, ranks quite highly on economic, not so high on societal, and a bit less so on environmental. So it dragged down its overall rankings. I think Christos can speak a little bit to that. Now, COP28 and the WTO ministerial are looming next year, along with really pivotal elections in the US and EU. They're calling it an election super year. So there are a lot of milestones coming up next year. It's really timely to be looking at all these issues across the board. We have trade fragmentation that we're confronting as a new era in policymaking. How, Christos, does all these risks reflect in this year's STI? And perhaps as a segue, maybe Steve can address what we can do about it. But Christos, how are these showing up in the STI? You might be on mute.
I am indeed, but now I am not. It's a very good question, Chun Wei. Thank you very much. Let's first think a little bit the framework within which we operate. All the things, very correct things that you said, and the policy implications. We showed the map of the countries that the economies that we evaluate and we study. And if we take a step back and we see the whole world has some of the problems that you mentioned already, right? We went from a global financial crisis in around 2007, 2008, and then we went into the trade tension between United States and China. After that, we had the pandemic. And after that, we had the beginning of geopolitical risks. So with the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, with the tension that exists between China and Taiwan, and just a couple of weeks ago, with a tremendous tension that exists in Middle East. So I think that if we see this framework, what we observe is that members of our STI have started considering how to minimize these risks. And part of that was to bring some of the supply chain production back home. And in addition to that, and this was the first step, but in addition to that, all the emergence of the geopolitical risks have brought back the idea of national security, which implies that we have new laws implemented in different parts of the world that essentially try to put restrictions on the trade of goods. Where is the production of different inputs of final goods is being made? So from that respect, we definitely are going to see, and we see a decline in trade. This is the globalization, which is a term with many different definitions, but nevertheless, what it says is that despite the fact that nominally the global trade increases, maybe with respect to volume, doesn't do so. We have not reached the levels of the pre-2007 volume of trade yet. So within this environment, we have all the policy issues that Steve described, and we have COP28 coming into place. And if we think about, and it was very, very correct that coordination and collaboration is a must. Sustainability and climate change are global problems. They cannot be solved by one unit only. We need a global alignment. And in some respect, COP28 will continue trying to do that. But we know what has happened in the past. We know that there is a lot of goodwill. We know that there are many different issues in the tables. But nevertheless, when we start discussing how this will be accomplished, then everybody looks the other way. So what is going to happen in COP and how this may be reflected in our STI? The first thing, I think, there will be an attempt to accelerate the energy transition and reduce the greenhouse gases. So this is a continuation of what is going on. So in that respect, we may see, not next year, because it takes a little bit of time for these broad issues, but if something with low standards is globally accepted, then we will see definitely something changing, maybe even from next year, but definitely in the future. The other issue is to enhance the climate finance, because in the end of the day, even though all of us worldwide agree with the objective, somehow who is bearing the cost is a completely different issue. And we also know that there is a lot of discussion between the developed countries and the developing countries. And somehow this transfer of many promised funds from the former to the latter has not been materialized yet. And I think this is going to be something that we should expect how now it will be seen. And that will have an effect also in all three pillars, depending on how this will be accomplished.
Thank you, Chris. Oh, sorry. Steve, were you going to say something?
Chunwei, I was going to request permission to pose a pointed question to Christos, if I may.
I love pointed questions.
Okay. Christos, apologies in advance for putting you on the spot, but I'm thinking about what our realistic expectations for COP28 should be. Look, we've got a certain set of commitments that have already previously been made. And it's generally recognized that if every single country in the world lived up 100% to every commitment they've already made, it still wouldn't be enough. But on top of that, we know that practically no one is living up to the commitments which we already recognize are insufficient. So given that, how realistic is it to expect meaningful outcomes from COP28? Apologies again for a very pointed question.
It is, and I wish I knew the answer, Steve. Right? I mean, I'm sure that I would have been a keynote speaker in the COP28, but nevertheless, let's decompose a little bit your very crucial question. I think that for most observers and even participants, COP will be the forum where new ideas will be tried, obviously may be pushed back, and hopefully what will be decided a couple of steps higher of the lowest point. It is indeed true that many of the things that have been promised have not been materialized. And in fact, if one speaks to skeptics, no one was expecting that this will be materialized. On the other hand, it is also true that there has been an improvement. Now we live in a period of time where, depending on whether we accept that it is an outcome of the climate crisis, as I do, or a random event that we had these tremendous weather conditions, we still have them all over the world. I think it implies that many different countries will start to have serious thoughts about how they themselves are going to deal with issues related, for instance, with increase of the water issues in the cities which are right next to water, or the fact that these extreme temperatures will not going to allow agricultural production to move forward the way it is, and so on and so forth. So there are some real issues now, while until very recently, despite the fact that scientists were screaming their heart off that this is going to happen, no one, maybe not that many people were thinking about it. But now we are facing that very, very seriously. So I don't know whether I answered the pointly question with a pointly answer, but nevertheless, I don't think I am an optimist. So I see good out of that exercise.
Thank you, Christos. I didn't find the answer particularly pointed, but it was a great answer. If you look at the STI, I think you would realize that COP28 has its work cut out for it. I think this year's STI showed that something like 13 out of the 30 economies have a worse performance in air pollution. 10 out of 30 have a worse performance than last year in the percentage of wastewater being treated. 18 out of the 30 has performed worse last year on energy intensity than the year before. There are a whole range of indicators in the Sustainable Trade Index 5.0 that tell us that COP28, people need to be paying much more attention to it. But so too the WTO ministerial. And this is where, I think, Steve, you might have something to speak on this. And there's a question from the floor from somebody watching called Jane Wateen. Jane, thank you very much for this question. And she's asking, is there anything that can be done either from the WTO or as countries to help maintain rules-based trade? The volatility and body blows, but that's a great word, great phrase, that the WTO has been taking affects the smaller countries the most, and they don't particularly have the weight to throw around. I think it's a great question. Steve, you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, thank you, Junwei, and thanks for the question. Look, in recent years, I think all of us, whether we like it or not, have had to come to accept the fact that it just doesn't look like the WTO is going to play that role that we always hoped that it would, that it was going to be the primary vehicle driving forward with ambitious multilateral trade and investment liberalization. For a whole variety of reasons, it's just not happening. We've got 164 highly diverse members with radically different points of view on the issue. The WTO, by definition, has to operate on the basis of consensus. And as if that wasn't a difficult enough a challenge to surmount, let's face it, some of the geopolitical tensions now have also spilled over into the WTO. So unfortunately, at least for the foreseeable future, I don't think we can expect some of those strong results out of the WTO that we initially hoped for. Now, that is not to say, by any stretch of the imagination, that we should give up on the WTO, or that the WTO doesn't have a relevant and a substantial role to play. And you're seeing a couple of things happen as progress across the board on full multilateral rounds has gotten bogged down. You see countries moving more towards the so-called JSIs, the Joint Statement Initiatives, in which a certain number of members get together and say, look, we can't bring the whole membership with us on this journey, but we have, for instance, a particular interest in e-commerce. Let's see what we can agree to among ourselves. And so I've lost track of the exact number. I don't know if it's in the 70s or 80s now, but a number of countries are working together to make progress on e-commerce. So I think there continues to be hope for things like that. But as I said, unfortunately, that role that we all initially hoped and expected the WTO was going to play when it was founded in 1995, for a variety of reasons, just hasn't materialized.
Yeah, quite right. Richard Katz wrote recently, you probably read it, on what he calls the rise of the mini-laterals, the mini-laterals. They used to call it plurilaterals, and I think they still are at the WTO, but he's calling it the rise of mini-laterals, because what's emerging is country to country, often bilateral or very, very small groups of countries, homing in on very, very narrow sectoral focus in terms of trying to negotiate something. And that appears to be the new basis on which the WTO is well, the WTO itself are probably, it's not being involved, but that's probably going to force the pace of change at the large institution, at the large body itself. I mean, it's a really pertinent question by Jade, so thank you. I have a bunch of other questions.
If you don't mind, I'll keep this very, very short, but it's right on the point that you just made about countries now moving towards these regional agreements or bilaterals or sectoral agreements. I very recently had a conversation with the trade minister of a Latin American country, and he said to me, look, Steve, if we had our choice, we'd be progressing a more ambitious agenda at the WTO. But if the WTO isn't going to move, don't expect us to stand still. Exactly. So we're going to move forward on exactly the basis that you were describing. And I don't think anybody should be surprised about that. Hopefully, it'll provide a bit of impetus for the WTO, but remains to be seen. Sorry, I just wanted to sneak that comment in quickly.
You're absolutely right. And, we're sort of crying out for a new set of policy recommendations for the WTO and how it should change. I think somebody should be working on that. I have
if I may add, and I'm not going to ask a pointy question to Steve.
You should.
But maybe I should. You're absolutely right. in our next meeting. But I think that this is the way of moving forward. That is to find, we see this with respect to sustainability issues as well. Why? Because different groups of countries may have similar very important concerns over one, but not the other issues. And what we see is that, for instance, NAFTA, for the countries that we are part of our index, the new NAFTA negotiated was, of course, much more keen with respect to certain environmental aspects. The same thing we see in other smaller regional agreements. In fact, the regional trade agreements, if one sees with respect of numbers, has skyrocketed. I mean, it's increasing every year more. And I believe that this is one of the reasons why we have them, because challenges are much easier to be negotiated and agreed upon with smaller members of groups. A group of 3 may decide much easier than a group of 160.
Yeah, no, quite right. That does look like the way forward when it comes to institutional failure. We have a bunch of questions here which address more the coverage of the STI in terms of the economies. We're just going to bunch them together as one. Some people are asking why we don't cover as many countries as we could. One of them is asking why Africa is not involved. Christos, Steve, you guys were sort of involved in the architecture of this of the index. Very quickly, do you want to just touch on these choices and moving forward, how you see the STI evolving?
Sure, I can jump in. It is not that we don't want to include more countries. It is the evolution of the index, which began really having as a center the oceanic, the South and Southeast Asia, and the oceanic part of the world, as we saw in the map. So, in fact, after the first three versions of the STI, we increased the number of countries 50%. The first two versions were 20 countries, 20 economies that were studied. Right now, we study 30. If the question is, can we increase the number of economies studied? Absolutely, yes. This is one of the things that we have brought up in our internal conversations. Can we do that at once? I am not sure. But nevertheless, it is not that we try to exclude any economy. On the contrary, we will be delighted to be able to include more. However, the way that we have structured it had a very strict initial point. Yeah. I don't know whether Catherine would like to.
Yes, I thank you. I'd be delighted to jump in there. One of the key things that we'd like to see the Sustainable Trade Index used for is to create conversations at the plurilateral level across the world. And in particular, there's a lot of sustainable trade conversations going on at the APEC, CPTPP, RCEP dialogue environments. And so that's one of the reasons why we've concentrated more on the countries that are involved in that conversation, because we think that there's an open door to have those conversations amongst the nations involved in those agreements. Incidentally, I noticed there was a very interesting question by Eduardo from Brazil about sustainability and the role of the public sector, and this is a great opportunity to talk about the fact that there are businesses that use the Sustainable Trade Index to assess the countries that they should be making their foreign direct investment into as they grow their service and manufacturing capabilities, because we look at risks. The risks of environmental degradation and the preparedness of economies to participate in trade, and the risks associated with societal attitudes. The Sustainable Trade Index can really help businesses who are making an assessment of where to place their next manufacturing plant, or where to make their next investment in a call center. So we hope that business will use the STI as well as governments to make choices based on the environmental and societal and economic risks that the STI presents.
Absolutely, yeah. And some of the indicators would be, you might want to look at domestic credit to private sector, which the STI has, non-tariff barriers, gross fixed capital formation, FDI net inflows, inequality, percentage of population in forced labor. I mean, these are all indicators that
education level
oriented, ESG oriented companies would be very much interested in. So excellent question, Eduardo, and thank you for your answer, Catherine. On it, I'd like to sort of pivot the conversation, and I'm very aware that we are bumping up against time. But I wanted to pivot back to the question of protectionism and a rise in trade barriers. This is something that is plaguing the growth of global trade. So Christos, I wanted to ask you what you make from this year's STI in terms of those increases. I mean, are there any economies that are particularly obtrusive in your observations, and are there any lessons to be learned?
I think yes. In fact, we are pointing out what the important elements for each pillar are. And I think that what we offer, and I go back to what Catherine and you were saying before, the index that we provide has different perspectives. It has an inspirational perspective, it has an educational perspective. But in the end of the day, what we allow is this capacity of comparing and contrasting. So we do not see completely one-way results. We don't see, for instance, all the countries plummeting in environmental pillar. You mentioned some very good statistics before from what we found today. Of course, you could have chosen to say the opposite, and then there would have been the countries who have improved vis-a-vis the countries that deteriorate. So what we are offering to both the public and also the private sector, but especially the public sector, is to put themselves in the shoes and see the business plan, within quotation, that they have, the vision that they have for their strategy, is compared with other economies at different levels. And also, what can they learn from the best practices of the economies that they perform very well? Yeah. And I think these are the elements that we provide. We provide a very strong element in the economic pillar, that you have to use a trade-off, as Steve was saying before, between innovation and infrastructure, as well as trade liberalization and barriers to entry. So these do not always go the same way. We saw that in the societal pillar, we have to pay very big attention, not only to increasing trade, but what are the implications of this trade for the human capital that we have. In fact, we have seen this from very advanced economies. United States comes in mind at once, right? And then in the environmental pillar, which is, I think, both the most important and the most difficult, we saw that the standards of the environmental standards are of paramount importance. And that's why we had the discussion about the COP and the WTO before, I feel.
Yeah, and there was one indicator that you had singled out, I think, in our discussions, which was on education, and it goes back to that point on human capital that you were talking about. Do you want to talk a little bit about how this was constructed and why it was put in there?
Chunwei, could I sneak in a very, very brief comment on the protectionism? Yeah. First of all, I think you put your finger on an extremely important issue. And when I take a step back and look at the issue of sustainable trade, this rising protectionism you referenced is really a concerning flashing yellow light for me. We have a very sophisticated index that we put together consisting of 71 very relevant and very insightful indicators across those three pillars. But I think sometimes, we have to be careful not to lose sight of what's perhaps the most fundamental aspect of trade. So sustainable trade. Trade is one of the most fundamental aspects of sustainable trade. We've got to keep trade open. We've got to keep trade flowing. And this rising protectionism that you referenced certainly isn't helpful in that regard.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. It looks like we might be bumping up against time, but Christos, do you want to quickly touch on the education point? Or?
Of course. In fact, what I will try to show you is a graph that we have here. Yeah. And I will be very, very brief. But education is an extremely important component on everything we study, from the Sustainable Trade Index to all the competitiveness rankings that we produce. And this is because it is of paramount importance for the future capability of an economy to increase the prosperity of its citizens via technology, via new innovation, via understanding issues related with different things that separate us. So what we have here is a very nice graph, which includes three different aspects. It includes the average years of schooling in the vertical axis. It includes the cross-enrollment ratio. This is what is the enrollment, what is the share of people who enrolled in institutions beyond the high school. And then we take into consideration the GDP per capita by the size of the bullet. And what do we see? We see there is a huge, what we call gap. What we find is that there is a discrepancy, alarming, I would say, between the countries that enjoy very high GDP per capita and the countries that do not. It's not everywhere the case. For instance, take a look of Peru, which tries to equate and do much better. On the other hand, you see that there are economies like Sri Lanka or Malaysia that basically pay tremendous attention in the education component. But nevertheless, what we see is a very big gap between the haves and have-nots with respect to GDP per capita.
Thank you, Christos. That's a really telling slide to as we wind up, because it sort of brings us back to this really poignant sentence that Ted Alden once wrote. It said that the 2/3 of US GDP actually voted for a certain Democratic candidate, and 1/3 of US GDP voted for a certain Republican candidate in 2016. And it was the Republican candidate that carried the day with great consequences. And it brings us back to the point that the Sustainable Trade Index is really for the long term. I think both Steve and Christos and Catherine have talked about this. This is a year-by-year charting of a long-term venture. And this is what we are trying to map. We are bumping up against time. I apologize to our viewers out there who have asked some really great questions. I want to thank you, Christos. I want to thank you, Steve, and thank you, Catherine. And thank you for everyone for joining the webinar today. We do have an interactive Excel. It's very fun to play with. So do download it. We have a stream of infographics that are coming up in the weeks ahead. We have country profiles of each of the economies that we cover. And that's a wrap from us today. You can download all these assets by scanning the QR codes that are going to be appearing on your screens about now. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.